So guys, probably the most requested video that I've ever had on this channel, to be honest, pretty much since the day that I started, is to do an updated settings guide for Battlefield 2042. I have done one of these in the past. I think it was pretty much around the time that the game launched, and a lot of that stuff is still relevant, but they've obviously changed the look of the settings, and they've also sort of added some new settings as well. And so I thought today I would go back and essentially update this settings guide to give you guys a better idea of what you can do with your settings, explain a little bit about what they do, as well as actually giving you a bit of a, I guess, a baseline to what you can use if you're not too sure what to set for your settings. Now, keep in mind that these are essentially mostly geared around controller players, so if you're on PC, I do apologize, not all of this is going to be relevant to you. Some of it will, because a lot of this is going to be also like the display settings and stuff like that, and all of that is still relevant to PC players, but mostly when it comes to the controller stuff, that's obviously not going to be relevant for PC players. So just keep that in mind. I know there are some really solid PC players out there who have probably done settings guides as well, but I think it's probably fair to assume that most of you guys watching are going to be on controller anyway, so just keep that in mind if you are on PC. Now, before we get into it, if you guys are new to the channel, then definitely hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. Season 1 has put this game in a really good direction, and there's going to be plenty of content on the channel in the next couple of weeks and months, so make sure you don't miss out on those. But with that being said, let's get stuck right into the settings. So I'm going to go through every single tab that you can see up the top there. A lot of this stuff isn't really that relevant, so I'm going to sort of quickly speed through this. When it comes to the general settings, these I've just got set all as on. None of these ones here really matter. Obviously, these are just the basic settings that really don't affect the gameplay at all. Now, crossplay obviously does affect gameplay. If you don't want to be playing against PC players and stuff like that, then you can obviously turn that off. But for me, especially being in Australia, I essentially need this to be on to even find games. So for most people, this is going to be set to 1. But if you just want to be playing with only PS5 players or only Xbox players, for example, then you can definitely turn that off. Now, when it comes to the network, these again don't really matter, so I'm not going to touch on those too much. Those are just set to the default settings. Now, moving on to the display settings, and these are pretty important actually. So the field of view, this is obviously to do with essentially how much you can see on your screen. Now, I have mine cranked all the way up. It's not quite at the end. I think the highest is 105 maybe, yeah, and I've got mine set to 100, so it's not quite there, but it is still probably very high compared to most people who play this game. What I will say is that about 90 is probably the perfect balance between it being zoomed out and giving you a little bit more field of view to where you can see more on your screen, but it's not too zoomed out, because for me, I'm fine with 100, but I know a lot of people that's probably way too zoomed out. So personally, I'd probably recommend 90, but if you can handle 100, then that's definitely really solid as well. I'll show you guys on screen what the field of view actually does in case some of you aren't aware. Essentially, the higher the number, the more you can see on your screen, but obviously that means that if there are enemies on your screen, for example, they'll be a little bit smaller. So maybe if you don't have the best vision, I would probably recommend sticking to just the default setting, but for me, I prefer seeing more on screen and being able to see a bit more to the side, just so that if someone's on the edge of my screen, I can still see them. But in reality, this one is essentially personal preference. Now, for the vehicle third-person field of view, I've got this cranked all the way to 88, which is the maximum. And although I said that the field of view in general is subjective, I would definitely recommend doing this for the vehicle one, simply because you want to see as much room around you when you're in a vehicle as possible. If someone's running up to you with a C5, you're going to see them a bit sooner than you would if you had this on the default setting. So I would personally put that up to 88, but again, it is somewhat subjective anyway. Now, for the ADS field of view, this one, for me personally, is really important, and I definitely recommend putting this to on. This essentially means that your field of view will match when you actually aim down sights. If you have this turned off, then you'll have a really high field of view, but when you aim down sights, it will zoom in a lot. Now, that can be handy for, seeing your targets a bit more clearly. If they're in the distance, you're going to see them as a little bit bigger, but it also gives more visual recoil to your weapons. And I'll show an example here. I've actually done a video on this in the past. When you've got this turned on, and if you do have a higher field of view like I do, this will actually reduce the visual recoil of your weapon. Now, it won't change the actual recoil. The pattern is going to be still exactly the same, but it essentially just looks like there's less on your screen, and that can help you stay on target a lot easier. When you're using a weapon that bounces around quite a bit, it's going to kind of move your screen more than this one does. That's the best way to explain it. The bullets are still going to go in the same place, so it doesn't actually affect gameplay, but it just makes it a little bit easier for you to kind of see what's going on, because if you've got a weapon that has a lot of kick, when you have this turned off, your screen will bounce around quite a bit. As for these settings here, I've just got the brightness on 50. That is just the default setting. The motion blur I've got just set to 10. I do like a little bit of motion blur, but not too much. And then I've got the vignette turned off. These ones are just obviously personal preference as well. Now, moving on to the general HUD settings, pretty much all of these I think are just on the default settings. I do have the camera shake amount turned down a little bit. This just means that when there's a bunch of explosions going on around you, your camera's is going to be a little bit less chaotic, I guess you would say. But as far as I know, the rest of these, yeah, the rest of these are pretty much the default setting. I've got these turned down a little bit, and this is the size of the HUD. So what this means is that the, you know, the weapons down in the bottom right, the ammo count and all that kind of thing, those are just a little bit smaller. These are just personal preferences, so these aren't going to be any better than others, but I just prefer having a little bit less HUD on the screen. Moving on to the crosshair settings, these are all completely default. I don't change anything to do with the crosshair, but it is worth going around and, you know, trying to see if maybe you like a different colored crosshair. I know that both yellow and purple crosshairs do tend to stand out in most situations more than white, so that is an option for some of you guys if you maybe have a hard time seeing the crosshair. For me personally, I've played enough shooters in my day that I don't really even need a crosshair at this point. I just know where the center of the screen is, and so yeah, for me these are all just set to the default settings. Moving on to the minimap, this is all again personal preference. This is just to do with the opacity and the size and stuff like that, so none of this really matters too much. I would definitely recommend just sort of toying around with it, seeing how you like it, but again, none of this really changes the gameplay. It's all just personal preference. Now lastly, moving on to the HUD icons, this one is actually pretty important. Now again, it is subjective because it just depends on how you want to play, but I'll go through and show you guys how mine is set up, and I'll kind of explain why some of this is probably a little bit different to how you guys have it set up. So you can see here that the enemy icons, they're all still set to 100. The reason for that is I don't want the enemy icons, and that means, for example, like someone who's spotted, anything to do with an enemy that is essentially displayed on the HUD, I want that to stand out 100%, so I don't want that to be transparent at all. So those are set to 100, but then for example, the neutral icons, so this would be like a flag that hasn't been captured by any team. I don't really care for that much. It's not really important information to me, so I've got it set to only 10% opacity when I'm zoomed in, and that just means if I'm looking at, say, the D flag and it's not captured by either team and I'm zoomed in on it, it barely shows up on my screen, and the reason for that is just I don't want as much clutter on the screen. And so essentially what these numbers mean is the lower the number, the less that icon is going to show up. So if you obviously set this to 0, then that means you will not be able to see it at all when you zoom in, and if it's set to 100, it won't go transparent at all. So as you can see, here are the rest of these settings. Again, these are all just personal preference, but at least now you guys know sort of why I've got it set up that way, and you can kind of use these as a baseline for your own settings, or you can just sort of toy around with that now that you guys know what these settings actually change. Now moving on to the sound, I've essentially got these all set to the default. The only difference is I've got it set to headphones instead of just the speakers. Obviously I use a headset, so that just means it's smarter to have it set to the headphone setting, but everything else in this is essentially 100% default. They've really improved the audio in this game over the last couple of months, so for me I don't feel like it needs any changing at all. Now for the voice chat, this is just stuff that doesn't really matter to me. If I'm going to play with friends, I'm going to be playing on Discord, so none of this is really that relevant to me personally. And then with subtitles, I've got the subtitles turned off, but again, that is just a personal preference. Now moving on to the controller settings, and this is where it does get a little bit more in depth, I guess you would say. Now it says here that I've got this set to default. I actually do play on alternate buttons here. Now the reason I've got it set to default right now is if you look at the back button down in the bottom left, currently it's working, but if I set that to alternate, it's got that bug where it says not set. So I've just, for the sake of this video, got it set on default, but I do actually play on the alternate settings, and this is a really important setting in my opinion. What this does is it changes your melee button to the B or circle button, and it changes your crouch or prone button to the right stick. Now what this allows you to do is it allows you to get into cover without actually taking your hand off the stick. So if you're being shot at, for example, and you're running and you want to sort of slide into cover, but you also want to look around and see where that's coming from, you can do that. Whereas with the default settings, to crouch, you actually have to take your hand off the right stick, or your thumb off the right stick, I should say. And that means it is actually impossible to crouch and look around at the same time. And so by putting it on alternate, this is one of the best things you guys can do, and it will feel weird. I'm going to say that straight away, that you're going to change this setting and you're going to be like, what is this dude talking about? This is the worst thing that I've ever done. And you're going to want to change it straight back. But trust me guys, stick with it for a week or so and just try and get to the point where it's actually natural, and that's, you know, you're not muddling up the buttons anymore. And I'm telling you right now, once you change this and once you get used to it, you will never ever go back. And any shooter that you ever play, you're going to be having to change this setting. For me, when I play any shooter, it's the same with Warzone, I have to have these on the alternate settings, and every shooter that comes out always has these, so it's not something you need to worry about. But this becomes so handy and such a better change that, yeah, you guys are never going to change back. So I know it sounds crazy, but trust me on this one guys, this is the single best setting in this entire game that you can change, and just give it some time, get the hang of it, and I promise you will never ever go back. Now I've also got the same for the vehicle buttons here. This just changes it so that I actually drive a tank, for example, with the right trigger, I reverse with the left trigger, and then I shoot with LB or L1 on PlayStation. Whereas with the default settings, RT, or, you know, the right trigger, or R2, that is to fire. And it kind of makes a little bit more sense, to be honest, but I've just grown to pretty much just be used to these settings here because that's how it used to be in Bad Company 2. on Battlefield 3 and stuff like that. So this one is just a personal preference. I'm just definitely better at driving a tank, for example, with this setting. So give it a try. It might not work for you, but this one is just personal preference. Now for the rest of these, I've just got these all set to default. I don't really play vehicles that much. I'll jump into tank every now and then, or I'll jump into chopper, but for the most part, I'm an infantry player. So if you're looking for, you know, a better vehicle settings guide, that's probably not for me to talk about, just because I'm not much of a vehicle player, but I'm sure there are players out there who have done the best settings for vehicles. So hopefully you guys can find someone who knows a bit more about what they're talking about. Now moving on to global here, these are all essentially just set to default. I'm fairly sure none of these are really that relevant for this video. Moving on to the on foot settings, I have my sensitivity at 40, which is for me just where it feels the most comfortable. This is the type of setting that is 100% subjective. There is actually no benefit to the sensitivity. The lower your sensitivity, the better your aim will generally be at sort of mid to long range, but then obviously the lower your sensitivity, if someone's behind you in close quarters, it will take you a bit longer to turn around. So it kind of just comes down to your playstyle. For me, I'm a bit of an aggressive player, but I also do like to fight at range too. So 40 is kind of just roughly in that middle area, that it's fast enough that I can turn around quickly if someone's behind me, but it's also not too fast to where if I'm trying to shoot someone at range, it's just spraying all over the place. So that is a setting that you guys are just essentially going to have to figure out for yourself depending on how you play the game. Now for the soldier aim assist, I've got this set to 80 simply because when the game actually launched, the aim assist was kind of busted, and when it was set to 100, it wasn't actually working properly. So I would actually recommend playing on 100. I'm just used to 80 at this point, so I just pretty much just stick to 80 because I don't want to have to relearn that. But I would probably recommend, now that the aim assist is a little bit better, to probably just set this to 100 because it makes more sense. Now the rest of these settings here are pretty much all, you know, basic settings. They're all set to default. What I'll say about the soldier zoom aim sensitivity, I've got mine set to 90, and what that means is that it is 10% less speed when I'm aimed down sights. So the best way to explain this is, obviously my sensitivity is 40. With this being at 90%, 90% of 40 is 36. So this just kind of means that when I'm aimed down sights, instead of my sensitivity being 40, it essentially turns to 36. It just gives me a little bit more control in those aim down sight situations. It is just personal preference. There's no technical reason to make that better, but for me personally, I just find that the slightly slower sensitivity when I'm aimed down sights just makes me a little bit more accurate. As for these settings here, these are all default except for the revive interaction. That is actually default on hold, but I've got mine set to toggle. This means that when I run up to someone and want to revive them, I simply have to tap the button and it will do the revive. I don't have to hold that. That means that I can still use my right stick to look around while I'm reviving them and making sure that there's no enemies, for example. Same goes for the skipping revive. I don't have to hold the button every time I die. I can just tap the button and it will skip that revive. And then these settings down here, these are all essentially default. Now the vehicle settings, again, these are not the type of thing that I need to be telling you guys about. These are all just default settings. I don't really play vehicles, so unfortunately I can't really help you guys there too much. And when it comes to the controller tuning, these are again all just the default settings. There's nothing really worth changing here in my opinion. Moving on to the accessibility settings, these are all again just default. It's kind of weird that they've got a lot of these in two different places. So we've already touched on the motion blur and the camera shake and stuff. That's a lot of what this accessibility stuff is. So none of these really matter. I've pretty much touched on all of those in, you know, earlier on in the video. Same for the subtitles, I've already touched on that. And then even same for the controls, like the revive interaction, I just touched on that earlier. So I don't know why they've got these in two places, but these are pretty much all accounted for anyway. And lastly, we have the extras, and these are essentially nothing. So that is pretty much all of the settings right there, guys. And hopefully that gives you a bit of a better idea of what these settings mean. Like I said earlier, this does not equate to these being the absolute best settings in the game. There is no such thing as the best settings. These are just what I personally use. But for those of you guys who maybe just really don't know what any of these settings mean, or you just don't know where to start, then hopefully this can be a bit of a baseline for you guys. I would recommend just starting off on what I've shown if you guys don't know where to start. And then if something feels a little bit off, you can obviously go and tune those even further. So probably a mix and match of using the settings that I've shown you, but then also changing them to your own personal preference. That's probably going to yield the best results. So definitely spend some time, even just in a private lobby, just sort of toying around with these and seeing what suits you guys the best. That is going to do it for this one though, guys. Hopefully that helped some of you guys out. And if there's any extra stuff that you guys wanted to know, be sure to leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like down below. If you guys are new to the channel, then definitely hit that subscribe button. And if you want to support the content that I make here on YouTube, then consider becoming a channel member. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll see you all out there on the battlefield.